Good morning and welcome to the fifth industrial revolution. My name is Rachin Kansal. I'm an executive with 20 years in the healthcare industry and an educator. I'm now a faculty at the Department of Management, Stillman School of Business at Seton Hall University and also lead at Center for Leadership Development. Out of interest, I'm also a project director of the fifth industrial revolution, a graduate level course that we will be teaching at Seton Hall starting fall of 2021, and also a narrative project that explores the intersection of human condition, of space exploration, and health technology. On one hand, on planet Earth, we are facing climate crisis. We are facing an AI-driven future of work. We are facing pandemics. The story looks bleak. On the other, we are making many advances. We can grow crops in water. We can do so much more. So the future is also very promising. So is that the fifth industrial revolution, a better future on planet Earth? We are also going into space. We have flown a helicopter on Mars. We have evidence of water on Mars. Russia has claimed Venus as a Russian planet. They are the only one who have landed a spacecraft there. And interestingly, Voyager 1 and 2, we launched them in 1977. Today, they have gone beyond the solar system. They are in interstellar space. It takes light 21 minutes to reach from there to here, 14 billion miles. Observable universe, 83 billion miles. So imagine, we have only explored 21 minutes of 83 billion miles. Wall Street is betting on it. They're calling it the next trillion-dollar industry, already estimated at $400 billion. So is that the fifth industrial revolution? Number three, if that is the fifth industrial revolution, are we ready? I mean, you as humans, we can't live outside of planet Earth. That's not how our bodies are made. So if that's what we are gonna do, we will need health technology. We will need to maybe become cyborgs. Is that the fifth industrial revolution? So those really are the questions we are trying to explore and see if we can come to a point where it all intersects and begins to define where we go as a human race from here. So with that, I would like to welcome today on our podcast, Dr. Arnold Glass. Dr. Glass, I'll call him Arnold, is a professor at Rutgers University. He is part of Department of Psychology there. His specialization is in cognitive psychology. And if I can say it right, Arnold, your research focuses on how our brain interprets information and then basically helps us speak it, write it, define it, explain it, and you're trying to convert that into models that can be then, converted into AI and computational models to replicate a brain.
Yes.
Wonderful. So, Arnold, why don't you just talk to us a little bit more about, your background, your research, and maybe explain to a sixth grader what you do and how it really, shapes our world.
Okay. Around 1968, right, there was a revolution in psychology called the cognitive revolution. Prior to that, psychology for a period of time had been based in analyzing and understanding observable behavior because there didn't seem to be any way to directly access mental phenomena. But after 1968, people developed techniques, though they were primarily behavioral techniques initially, to actually get at people's thoughts, their memories, their understanding. And that became the cognitive revolution, ability to gain a much deeper understanding of human understanding and of human memory and human learning than we ever had before. And that was followed about 20 years later, at most maybe 15 years later, by what we call the cognitive neuroscience revolution, because then fMRIs were invented, which allowed you to now look at brain activity when someone was actually moving around. EEGs, which had been around for a long time, they were perfected, so you could coordinate them with behaviors and even kinds of thoughts. So now you not only could have a more accurate functional model of thoughts and memories, but you could connect it to the underlying neural activity for the first time. And that's led to really explosion of research in this area. And clearly there's a lot more than, I'm very happy with my career choice because I thought it would be exciting and there would be a lot of new stuff, but it's a field where every year there's an amazing new discovery that fundamentally alters your understanding of your field. And so it's very exciting and fun to be a part of a field like that, where you really are exploring, discovering new things. And so we're in a position today to understand a lot more about factors that affect human understanding and learning and memory than we were when I began. But ironically, this has come along at just the time when new technologies are unexpectedly, fundamentally altering humans' abilities in these areas. Cognitive abilities are being altered in relationship to the new devices we're using. And so that's what a lot of my recent research has been focusing on.
Wonderful, wonderful for that lesson in history as to how this field of cognitive psychology has come into being, and it's only about 40, 50 years old, but the advances that it has made. So if I were to ask you, based on last 50 years of research in the space, how would you identify the nature of human race? Are we just people living through the years we have on planet Earth since we are born to the time we die? Are we explorers? How would you define the human race as cognitive psychology would define the human race?
Okay, that's a very good question, because it leads to another revolution in this understanding. Just at the turn, perhaps, of the last century, this came forward. Because thought is something that a person does. Memory is something a person has. Most of the history of psychology, even though there was a very large area called social psychology, was focused on the individual, right? And certainly, study of cognition, learning, and memory was focused on the individual. But then, as a precursor to this, again, actually, a little more than 50 years ago, a professor at Harvard, the name of Edmund Wilson, wrote a book called Sociobiology. Yeah. And interestingly enough, Wilson was the preeminent expert in the world on insects. Right? But insects, actually, as we know, are highly social creatures, whether you're talking about bees or ants or all other kinds of things. And he had the idea where he put it forward in his book that he was in the biology department, but that you couldn't understand biology without understanding the social behavior of animals, that they were intimately linked. Mm-hmm. And highly controversial for many decades, but it turned out to have been very influential because in certain aspects it turns out to be correct. Right? We all know that human beings today are in certain regards fundamentally different from all other animals. Yes. Our cognitive abilities are simply on a different level. I mean, no other animal has invented a language to talk to each other, or does any of the, or has any of the mechanical progress that we've had. And we can ask the question, why is that? And the person who really gave the answer just at the end of the last century was an anthropologist by the name of Robin Dunbar. Okay. England. And he looked at it in the framework of something people knew, is that you can look at the animal kingdom, and there's some animals who are relatively non-social. They tend to spend time alone. Cats actually are not particularly social. But then there are other animals that are much more social, right? Including wolves, for example, but all the large herbivores, elephants, horses, they all tend to be social animals. And you can ask the question, in nature, are you better off being a social animal living in a group, or an animal that tends to live by themselves? And the answer immediately, question immediately answers itself. Social animals have huge advantages over non-social animals, precisely because they live in groups. They're less likely to die of starvation. They're less likely to be eaten by another animal, because the group synergy creates more opportunities than trying to do everything yourself. Now, if you look even further, and you can make a scale of how social animals are, or anything from insects to to humans, you find that there are a few animals that you have to call hypersocial.
Okay.
They go beyond mere social. And how would you identify a hypersocial animal? A hypersocial animal is so social, right? They so dislike being alone that their sociability transcends species. They enjoy being with animals and other species, and that gives them an inherent pleasure that they'll seek that out beyond being themselves. And then the next interesting thing is that all of the truly domesticated animals, from dogs to horses to cows, they all, in fact, are hypersocial animals. And the entire reason why they're able to live with humans is they get the same thing out. They often get one thing that humans get out of it, but they always get out of that. They enjoy the company.
Company, yeah.
And that every animal that's really domesticated, truly domesticated, is that way. So it's interesting that horses don't like being alone at all. They live in groups, and they prefer to have the company of someone riding on their back. They're running around by themselves. It's just amazing, but that's just the way it is. And so if you look at the animals that have become domesticated and close to humans, they're animals that, in fact, that in their wild state lived in highly social groups, hierarchies. They liked to obey rules and things, right. And therefore they were the natural kind of animal to join with humans, because all their needs were met by human association. So, right. So you can see how general this is beyond humans, what it means to be hypersocial, and also the advantages. Now, who's a cat lover may say, "What about cats?" And I think it's correct to say that the cats are not domesticated in the same sense of these other animals, or they've learned to tolerate humans to the extent that they'll live among us. Okay, but even many people who have cats know that most cats are really not.
Keep the distance. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, even there, through breeding, there is a hypersocial subspecies of cats. Siamese cats actually have been specially bred, and they actually will behave in a social way. So those cats are not so much separated by evolution from the other similar mammals, but in general, most species of cats are not really social, including most house cats, except for those few that have been bred for social side issue. Okay, because we go back to humans, who human line splits off from our two closest relatives, the chimpanzee and bonobo, 3 billion years ago, and it starts to develop. And what you find happening with humans is all three species are very highly social, hypersocial animals. So humans are very hypersocial, and they cross a barrier 1 million years ago where they're walking upright, and they're making tools.
Yes.
The important thing is that they live in very effective groups. because they're living in very effective groups, they are coming to dominate their environment more and more. And as they come to dominate their environment more and more and more, what happens is that the normal drivers of evolution, right, possibility that you'll die of cold or hunger or thirst, or that you'll be eaten by a predator, those factors turn out to be less and less important for humans, because as a percentage, humans are no longer overwhelmingly dying, depending on their abilities in those lines. So what happens? Does evolution at that point slow down? No, it actually speeds up, and you can see human evolution speeding up enormously. But now what's driving human evolution is not their ability as an individual to hunt particularly, but their social standing in their family. The higher they are in the tribe, the more successful they are, and the better they're doing. And the lower they are, lower status people are just not doing that well. And you can see a similar phenomena in various monkey groups like rhesus monkeys, but you certainly see this in humans, say. So what happens is now human evolution is sped up, and it turns out that cognitive abilities and social behaviors get into this positive feedback loop. Because in order to become more social, that is, more aware of what everyone else in the group is doing, so you can anticipate their needs, so you, most important, can ingratiate yourself or dominate them, you have to get smarter and smarter.
Mm-hmm.
People are becoming smarter and smarter. Of course, they're becoming more and more social. And as they're becoming more and more social, that's still putting demands on them to become smarter and smarter. So in the last 3 million years, you have this huge increase in the cognitive abilities and the social abilities of humans. So they become modern humans maybe 100, 200,000 years ago. And then you're in a whole different ball game. And then, of course, what happens is sometime between 50 and 100,000 years ago, well, comes the final step. If you go back like 100,000 years ago, there were humans over most of the globe. Certainly in Africa, in Europe, in Asia, there were there were sapiens, there were Neanderthalensis, there were Denisovan humans, and maybe other kind. And we know for a fact, because they interbred, that sapiens and Neanderthals were only subspecies. They really weren't separate species at all, variabilities. And people think that's probably true of Denisovans if they could ever measure their DNA. So you have a bunch of people all around the world. And until the discovery of mitochondrial DNA in the 70s, people thought that all the people in the world today were essentially descended from all these clusters of people around the world, right? People in Africa were descended from people in Africa, and people in Europe were tribal. Everything, it seemed reasonable. I mean, but then what happened is that when there's the first breakthrough in DNA analysis is that mitochondrial DNA has this interesting quirk in that whether you're a man or a woman, you only inherit mitochondrial DNA from your mother, not from your father. So you can draw a straight line in mitochondrial DNA for any mammal, and for other mammals, the female line back in time. And over time, there are like minor errors occur in the DNA. So by counting the number of errors, since it turns out the errors turn out to accumulate pretty constantly over time, by counting any two peoples in the world, how similar their mitochondrial DNA is, you can with reasonable precision say how many generations you have to go back to find their common great-great-great-great-grandmother. And you can you can give a year estimate for that is. And when they applied this, when they were able to do this for the first time with humans, in the 1970s or 1980s, I forget exactly the year, but right around 1979, they made a discovery which no one in the world dreamed of, which is that everyone in the planet was descended from one family that lived in East Africa
Yeah.
100,000 years ago. And when at the end of the last mini ice age, when that family moved north,
Yes.
Europe, and then to Asia, all the other human beings in the world disappeared except for a small amount of interbreeding with that group of people. Okay, so that's a tremendous demonstration of the social advantage of one group of people. Okay, how we were all the same in this tiny group who dominated the whole planet, and certainly I think the critical thing that they had, which allowed them to dominate the planet, was the fact that they had invented language, human language. Because all the languages in the world have descended from one common language, which was invented in Central Africa at about that time. And so we really have a very close linked common heritage. And if we look at why our ancestors dominated, they had this leap in social ability once they had language along with other abilities and tools. And so if you want to know why humans dominate the world today, it's because they're the most social creatures. And they've put this to great advantage in specializing occupations and learning from one another. And that's the core of our strength. And we don't even realize how hypersocial we are, but we really are social, and it's really been our benefits. So that's the framework in which a cognitive scientist like me views the world, because it's not only what abilities we have, but why do we have these particular abilities and what do we use them for? Right? I mean, why do humans have such good visual recognition?
Right.
That's because we need to be able to recognize each other's faces. And that takes a lot of practice, and you have to have good visual recognition skills to do. If you want to see how close humans actually look to each other, I mean, go to a zoo and look at all the rhesus monkeys. They all look the same to you. Well, they look as different as humans from each other.
Yeah.
Well, start at an early age practicing our visual recognition skills, because we identify each other as individuals, not as groups. And so your cognitive abilities and your social abilities are completely linked. And to understand human success, you have to understand how they interact.
This is fascinating. I mean, just the whole thesis here as to how humans are essentially hypersocial species, and I mean, my key takeaway, and tell me if I'm wrong, but after listening to how animals behave, the different species behave, and how the current human race all goes back to one family, and that has kind of dominated the world. It almost sounds like that the human race is about domination, right? Domination of their environment, domination of each other, domination of whatever.
Yeah.
So if the human race is about domination, I could almost project and say we have now dominated the world, and now we have to dominate what's beyond world. Is that a fair statement? I mean, would the understanding of human race as a dominant race naturally lead us to dominate what we have not dominated yet, which may be beyond planet Earth?
Yes, and that's because part of our basic cognitive abilities, which we show with other animals, is that we like to explore. I mean, mice and rats like to explore. I mean, it's a very useful feature, again, when you look at the interaction between cognitive and social, because we also have the ability to map our environments well, and we like to map our environments well. And of course, these are all very useful survival skills. So we start out sharing with many other mammals, the desire to explore the environment, the desire to map it, And then what happens is we're still living in that framework for the entire universe. So yes, I mean, that's essential to being a human. That's part of the human spark. We're not the only animal that has it, but it's not just something we acquired along the way through culture. That was part of humans long before we reached our current level, because that's true of a lot of mammals. They like to explore. I mean, that's why cats, who might be the second most popular species, successful species in the world, they're not social, they're very different from us. They exist every place from the equator to the Arctic. They exist every place from sea level to the high mountaintops, because they share that natural exploratory impulse to conquer new territory. Okay, they're not the kind of creature that will, as a group, individuals will become attached to their homes, but as a group, the group likes to expand into new territories. And so that's just part of us. That's something we learned along the way. It's not an ideology. It's a part of most animal and human existence. The interest in going and seeing something new, and therefore to explore, and therefore to conquer new territory, therefore to dominate. Yes.
Wonderful. So if the race, I mean, all animal species, but especially humans in the most advanced form of domination, if that's what we are and what we strive for, why develop technology like AI that can overtake us? I mean, right now there is all this talk about AI will take over future of work, right? AI will.
Well, okay, that's a good question. We could talk about that. That's very interesting, because I'm an enthusiast, I must say, for new technology and new so I see the positive use, both AI and technology. However, I mean, and not that long ago, I was at a conference where everyone there was really an engineer except for me. They're mostly engineers. And the person who gave the keynote was an engineer, and it was sponsored by NSF, looking at the future. And he said, you know, as AI emerged, if you go back, and even broadly into science fiction literature, but also predictions at the time, there were two views of AI. One view was that it was some sort of threat, that we were going to build robots that were going to compete and replace us, specifically better than us. And he said the other view was that it was going to be this great benefit, because it was going to be in form of super smart tools that would essentially enhance our powers and make super to what we were before. And he said, if you look at the experience now that there is functioning AI in the world, it's clear that it's 100% on the side of creating super tools.
Yeah.
No one is creating any AI that's remotely like a human or has intention or purpose, who's a competition for us. But several AI tools have been invented that have transformed particular areas into superhuman versions of them previous selves. So he mentioned that, for example, in astronomy and astrophysics now, every night they map more stars than 50 years ago they did in a lifetime.
Right.
It's because of AI. Okay.
Yeah.
To track them all. So AI is clearly moving in a way where primarily, if we keep control of it, it's enhancing our abilities. And it doesn't appear, given the kinds of specialized purposes tools we're developing, wherever on the horizon of no matter how smart it gets, of creating anything that's going to compete with us. We're that's not what we're building. We're building useful, the end game for the tools you see is not us being overwhelmed by mechanical versions of ourselves, like in the original play Are You Are, but being guided through life partners, which are essentially mechanical dogs who love being with us and we love being with them, and we have a social bond, but they have all these additional abilities and we work together because they're very smart. That's the direction that AI is heading. So we don't realize, I don't think, for the moment, I can't see anyone a realistic path to it being a threat to us. in that sense. But nevertheless, as an enthusiast, there have been negative consequences which people have been blind to, and which it seems impossible to get the message out to the larger public. Even though there are overwhelming benefits to AI, if people aren't appreciate the downside, then these downsides are going to hit us with a vengeance. And it was my fate to discover one of the downsides of the introduction of this new technology into the world. So that's to where we are now.
Well, wonderful. So this description of AI as a super tool, I mean, even if we look back to, the Stone Age, where maybe the stone tool was the super tool, and in the Iron Age, different super tools, and today it's technology-based super tools. So absolutely, they've helped us in human evolution and will continue to. And that's a good thing if we can control and balance, the downsides. A spinning, machine can cut your hand. Similarly, AI can. But do you think we will see further bifurcation of a dominant part of our society and the non-dominant part, the dominant having more access to these super tools, and they become the haves, and then they are the ones who get the better future, seek the better future, are able to get a better future, whatever that is, on Earth and beyond. And then there'll be a class that, like you were saying, there was a whole set of humans that disappeared. Somewhere along there, will we see another bifurcation happen if people become haves and have-nots in terms of these super tools?
That's a political choice, and that could certainly happen.
Okay.
And sadly enough, people again have to be aware that a lot of political decisions get made all the time on how to use these things, how to distribute benefits, and sometimes in the political struggle, it's the few have more power and influence to increase their share rather than distribute it to the many. So there's nothing inevitable about the tool leading to this conclusion. What the issue is a political decision has to be made when these tools make everyone more productive and everyone better off. So by any reasonable standard, we all have a higher standard of living than we had in 1950, but roughly between 1950 and 1970, the gains were distributed equally among the population. But now, while the gains have continued, it's obvious that they've been distributed unequally among the population. So the vast majority of people have not benefited, and a tiny number have benefited. And that hasn't been because it's this tiny number who are producing all the gains. No, I mean, political power was wielded to cause all the benefits to go to the few rather than recognize the fact that these gains are only made possible because of our social network by everyone
participating, yeah.
Absolutely. And therefore, everyone is entitled because everyone who's part of our social system, there's no one who you'd say their role was not vital. It was vital. I mean, if they didn't do it, that's a hole which has to be filled by someone else. So it's part of the system, and they're entitled along with everyone else. And the fact that we have not been distributing things along this line lately has led to inequality.
Yeah, no, I mean, you bring up important ethical aspects here, and the political aspects as to how there has to be a fair distribution of what we have, and maybe that will not happen. So we'll see where it goes. So let me just switch a little bit here and ask you a different question. So, given your research of how we interpret things and how we can translate into computational models, are you seeing application of those models either in the field of healthcare or the field of space exploration that help you foresee where those futures might go?
Right. I'm not intimately familiar with those areas. I don't see this being applied right now in the field of space exploration at all. There are definite attempts, and there have been all along attempts to apply this kind of work in the field of healthcare in a variety of ways. And some of them have been useful, and I have, you know, and I'm sure they're going to be more useful in the future. But there have been, as we've been flying these boats, there have been some remarkable stumbling blocks. So this is an area of intense research and interest, and there are things that haven't been resolved. So there, for example, there's two disorders which are now well known in the public for a variety of reasons, because they're odd and because sometimes some famous people have them: anorexia and bulimia. Anorexia is where you refuse to eat altogether, and bulimia is where you eat but then you throw up with food. Interestingly enough, because again, this is related to my research, even though this disorder seems similar, they actually have two completely different causes. I mean, anorexia turns out to be fundamentally a neurological disorder. I mean, it isn't because of anything that happened to you. You're born with a bad wire in your brain, and sometime it goes off. And anorexics have, sadly, literally starved themselves to death if they haven't been put in custody and engaged in supervised eating. Bulimia, however, is not a neural disease. It's a social disease, okay, where people do internalize certain bad body image, which they're not born with, but they acquire, and then engage in bulimic behavior. So that's one advantage of doing this kind of cognitive social research. You actually discover these things that you wouldn't know in advance. So they have quite different treatments. But the interesting thing is those kinds of things, it turned out for a while people were trying various kinds of medications to treat them. And it turned out that that there are effective treatments, but the treatments that are most effective and shown to be most effective, gold standards, are purely behavioral treatments. Again,
Right.
we go back to the fact that we're social creatures. We're designed to respond to social cues that affects our thoughts, our feelings so much. And when people understood how these things work, the absolute gold standard was not to give them a particular kind of medication, but to give them the appropriate behavioral treatment.
Yeah.
That's the way you cure these disorders. So that's a direct application of what you're talking about, of work related to mind that is very effective. Okay, but as I said, so we have some tremendous successes. This work is continuing, but the next step beyond this, people thought, was that Sam and the same brilliant research as well. If we can cure bulimia and anorexia, then maybe we can apply modified versions of these techniques to also cure obesity. Okay, and that has so far turned out to be a much more difficult behavioral problem than more extreme cases. And there's no question that obesity is not a neurological disorder. Because you could move people from one group to the other, here they're thin, here they're fat. It's a social behavioral disorder, and it's proven to be extremely difficult. There are no good effective treatments for obesity. There are people, as we know, it's the last resort. People literally go have major surgery to have their stomachs wired shut
Yes.
to do that. And by the way, follow-up research suggests that when it works, it doesn't work even for the reason people think. Okay, because what happens is there are people who have that surgery who get fat again. The body just adjusts to the band. But what happens for some people, there are sort of knock-on effects in terms of cravings, which can lead to changes in social interactions, and it's that which actually causes those people, not the actual physiological effects, but the knock-on post-social effects, which actually cause them to keep the weight off. But the fact that we're going to such extreme things shows that we really still have an enormous way to go to fully understand and therefore come to grips with and effectively control our cognitive behavioral systems, because we can't control eating yet, and when we can do that, then we'll say we're really beginning to get a grip on our understanding and ability to control desires, and it's more and more. I mean, we're getting to the point where all kinds of disorders and maladies people have. There are increasingly large behavioral components to them, and people are understanding like all of the addictions have very large. I mean, just like people say, the one addiction where when you go through withdrawal, there are serious physical consequences. Is alcohol. You have delirium tremens. I mean, you really have to watch the person, but other addictions, there's no similar physical manifestation in the body which is associated with withdrawal. So you wouldn't say the person has this physical thing that happens that keeps them using it, but there's this very strong behavioral component.
Yeah.
Just like simple obesity, that turns out to be incredibly difficult to develop an effective strategy that's going to help. But it's not going to be a pill. You know that, No, it is even going to be a little tweak in the brain, because it's the whole brain that's operating. So these are going to have to rely on a better understanding of the whole cognitive behavioral systems that we live in to discover how we can effectively alter these kinds of thoughts and behaviors.
No, that's again, a pretty fascinating perspective that we are socially dominating creatures, and our behavior drives a lot of what we do. And if we can understand behavior, we can really, there are many conditions we can treat that are not a trip of a wire in our DNA. And I can actually see, if we can begin to do that. One thing that comes to really my mind is, there is something to say about meditation. And there's something to say about, those exercises we can do with our brain that can alter how our, diseases may progress or get controlled. And that's certainly an emerging area which is getting a lot of attention. So this is wonderful. Anthony, Tillman, I would like to open it up to you both. Based on what we have heard so far, what comes to your mind? Any questions you'd like to ask?
I do. I actually do have one question that it's kind of been ruminating in my mind for a little bit too, Dr. Glass. So you had first mentioned the positive feedback loop, sort of like we're becoming more increasingly socialized as we continue to explore, and as a result, we continue to get smarter. And I also found it interesting where you say that AI will not be our undoing. But do you see like a future in which maybe our exploratory nature and our growing smarter, in a sense, is maybe our demise as a human race, or do you see us maybe curbing that before we get to that point?
Why would being smarter lead to our demise? I'm not sure what scenario you see that's where we wipe ourselves out.
Oh, I apologize. So maybe I should have phrased that a little bit better. But you had mentioned that we do sort of have like the positive feedback loop where, and I'm thinking maybe there's a future where maybe we become too exploratory or too maybe invented it for our own good. And then in that case, that's sort of a future where, you had mentioned is not feasible, where AI is going to kind of take over. I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on that, and why would that not happen? Because based on what you're kind of saying, it's kind of our nature to continue to innovate and continue to explore. And do you see that being sustainable for however many years that we're on this earth, or will we eventually sort of have our own undoing?
Okay. In terms of, okay, that's been a familiar trope in fiction for a long time, which I've liked to read my whole life, so I'm familiar with it, which is the idea that some scientist or engineer invents something which leads to the destruction of the human race, whether it's a super germ or a super atomic bomb or something, but it's the opening of Pandora's box. Something gets invented, which then becomes so powerful, leads to massive destruction. And I don't really think that's particularly plausible. It can only be written by someone who doesn't appreciate the difficulty involved in making even incremental scientific advances, and then the further difficulty in translating this through good engineering into an actual device. And by the time you've gotten to your first working model, which normally fails, you're fully enough aware of everything you've done at that point that the notion that the person can keep all this by doing all this tremendously intricate work, and yet they don't know its most obvious consequence is just not plausible. They're not going to accidentally invent the bomb that's going to blow up the whole world. By the way, I might say as a coda to this, I think that people that the thing that drives these stories, of course, modern era is the invention of atomic weapons, however, I don't think people. I personally believe this is that the invention of atomic weapons was a kind of accident, in that if World War II wasn't raging, right, and therefore there weren't some very smart people who were very, very scared of the consequence, which turned out wasn't going to happen. The Nazis invented the atomic bombs. The amount of intellectual effort and financial resources would have never been placed into developing a weapon whose existence was only theoretical. And to this day, we would be living in a world without atomic bombs at all. And therefore, I think that's a very huge hurdle to this ever happening again. So, no, I don't really think that's that. I mean, as I said, there are other problems which I hope we'll get to with AI, but that's not the one I think this is going to do us.
Well, and I also want to bring up, because I think it's interesting you brought up the atomic bomb. There's an argument to be made. Obviously, when we dropped the two, there was an extreme loss of life. But there's an argument to be made that technological development of an atomic bomb, establishing mutually assured destruction across the globe, potentially prevented a World War III. You think about the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis, the idea that we would turn this whole thing into a dust bowl and a red planet, may have prevented another mass scale war like that. Is there an argument to be made that potentially this technological advancement, as malicious as its intent, may have actually in the end saved lives?
Okay. Well, there's two separate issues. I think you can certainly justify the dropping of the two atomic bombs, but that's a separate question. The thing is that if you look at the first two nations, and then 3, 4, 5, but let's go first two nations of that had atomic weapons. First the United States, and then Russia. And we can say, okay, the invention of atomic weapons make those nations safer or less safe? And it's immediately apparent that the invention of atomic bombs made both nations less safe. And if they could wave the magic wand and wiped out those atomic bombs, they would have both done it. And at least certainly their generals would have, who understood. Because prior to the invention of the atomic bomb, the United States, separated from any possible adversary by two gigantic oceans, was literally invulnerable to attack. Absolutely invulnerable. They never had to worry about that. There was just no possible way anyone could attack them. I mean, they'd be in the ocean for 3 days and they're coming. I mean, you didn't even have to have shore defenses around the clock. It takes so long to get to you. And Russia had a similar thing. I mean, any attempt to attack Russia, first from France and then Germany a century later, it just fell apart because Russia's just too wide and too cold, and you weren't going to successfully do it. So it was invulnerable from attack, and all that atomic bombs did was take away huge advantages that those countries had. And you can say the same thing for a united Europe and for India and for China, so that atomic bombs made all of the holders of those bombs much less safe. And they were able to, we should be relieved that they were able to negotiate the most dangerous period, by not wiping each other out and carrying out mutually assured destruction. But there were a number of close calls along the way, and it could have been quite a bit different. So no, I don't think that, I think anyone who's rational, and especially a military leader concerned with defense, sees right away if there were it's a political, it's sad, it's a political problem, but if they could deal with it purely rationally on a military basis, then the U.S. and Russia would tomorrow lead an effort to wipe the last atomic bomb off the face of the earth, because it would clearly make them, but almost everyone else, much safer, because once you don't have them, you have a lot of areas that are very vulnerable, really invulnerable to attack, especially today with the new AI nets we fill up all around the world and satellites and everything else. There's no way that you could ever have a sneak attack again. I mean, that's just impossible. So combining with modern AI and just the physical distance of countries from one another, you would have a safer and more stable military situation without atomic weapons than with them.
Wonderful. So yeah, I mean, we go back to, super tools, if managed appropriately, are a good thing. They can create some tensions, but overall, there is good news for the human race. We are going to have a different future. That different future could take many forms. We don't know that yet, but very clearly, this next generation of super tools that we are creating, by better understanding who we are and how we behave and how we act, will absolutely be, part of that future. So very, very interesting and very fascinating discussion this morning, Dr. Glass. I learned a lot. I am sure Tillman and Anthony learned a lot. Hopefully, just speaking with us has triggered some questions in your mind that will be, feeding you over the future. But we really want to thank you for making the time.
Thank you for having me. I greatly enjoyed it. I wish all of you the best with your own lines of work. Absolutely.
Wonderful. Yeah. And then we'll, of course, share this broadly, and we'll keep in touch. And if we find something great in the future, we will connect back with you and make connections for you as well.
I would greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Weekend. Okay. Bye.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Glass.
Bye.
Well, that was a very interesting conversation with Dr. Glass as to how we are, as human beings, really are driven by a desire to dominate. And what that tells us is we are going to be a very different race in the future that dominates not just this planet Earth, but maybe, a lot beyond. So more to come on that. And thank you for listening.